Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm joined here with Rachel Wynn. Rachel's the founder of Starlight Social, a social media company that she started in 2015. She's also the leader of a brand called Feminist Founder, where she hosts a monthly meeting for women identifying entrepreneurs seeking community and collaboration. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rob. I'm excited to chat with you.
So I'd love to kind of just dig into your story and how you built your business. First off, why are you interested in building businesses on your own instead of working for someone else?
Sure. So I would say that my story actually started around 2014. I was working for a large co-working company that I'll leave unnamed. Um, I was working for a large co-working company, and after being there for about 8 months, I was fired, and I hadn't had any notice. I had not had any negative performance reviews, so it was very abrupt. And because it was an at-will type of situation, there was really nothing I could really do about it. So pretty much 5 days after I was fired, I was talking to a colleague, and he's like, "What are you going to do next?" And I said, "I have no idea. I was planning to be with this company, like this like kind of tech startup, for a long time. Like I had stock options. It was like very, very sad." And so basically he's like, "Well, why don't you start your own company?" And I said, "What? At the time, this is 2015. So I was like, I'm 25. I don't know anything about running a business, you know?" And he said, "Well, just come to a networking event and just see how it feels." And so I went, and then it felt great. I went just kind of saying, "Oh, Wynn Communications," some kind of firm related to my major.
Exactly.
And then 5 days after that, I filed for my LLC. And so what it really came down to, and the reason why I ultimately decided to take that jump, is because I was really frustrated about that situation, because what if I had had like a parent I was caring for, or children?
Mm-hmm.
I just couldn't believe that job security was just really no longer a thing in our society. And so I just really wanted to take back control of my economic destiny so that I could really kind of make make the success and happiness that I desired on my own terms.
Wow. Intense story. You obviously, as you mentioned, you didn't do this necessarily just by yourself. It was along with other people and talking with other people. We all don't live in a vacuum, right? So
Right.
what were some of those conversations that you kind of had early on? Because I imagine, imposter syndrome must have been there. How do I even go about starting? So like, what were the kinds of conversations that you were having, especially in those early days?
Yeah, I think the biggest conversations were just around, what do I do with my time? Because when you're so used to having a boss or a manager, it's kind of easy to just default to following that person's lead. But when you're self-employed, suddenly you're the boss and the employee and the bookkeeper and the
Yeah.
marketing person. So I think the biggest thing that I struggled with when I first started was what to do with my time when I was just starting out with new clients. So what I did, to be honest, I slept a fair amount when I first started out, because I suddenly had freedom and I was frankly exhausted from that former job. So I slept, and I also did a ton of networking events. So I was just running around DC, just networking my butt off and emailing colleagues and just talking to people to ask if they knew anyone who needed social media services. So it was a lot of confusion, a lot of trial and error. And I think that one of the things that I did was just start with my rates really, really low, because I felt like I still needed to kind of learn how to provide the best kind of service. So I started with low rates, and then it just grew steadily from there. But in the beginning, it was a lot of confusion. And I don't know, just because, I mean, there's a ton of resources online. You can Google everything you need to know about starting a business, but I feel like there's a lack of, I don't know, like a concrete roadmap to how to start it. I mean, it's just confusing from the beginning. Like, do I even get an LLC or some other kind of business structure, or should I, there's just so many choices you have to make, and it's not really easy to kind of do that alone. So
Yeah.
that's why I created Feminist Founder in 2016, is because I just felt like this is really difficult, and we shouldn't be muddling through this alone. We should just be doing it together.
So, leading me on, I guess, on to the next question around accountability circles in particular. You run these now, but in general. So, what are accountability circles, and why are they helpful? Like,
Yeah. Yeah,
especially to people just starting their own businesses.
right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's exactly why they're so important for people who are self-employed, because you have to be self-motivated. I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. I mean, I, from the exterior, might look like I'm like super successful. And while I feel I am, I certainly have a lot of doubts and a lot of stressors. So I think that what it really comes down to is just figuring out, I don't know, just kind of what you struggle with. So for me, I'm a night owl, so I struggle, and I had a lot of guilt when I first started with, like, you know, waking up at 9 or 10 versus like the 5 a.m. hustle that everyone's talking about. But I think that when you have an accountability group or an accountability team, I think you have to identify what your weaknesses are and then come up with ways to do that. So for example, actually with my business partner, we literally just switched having 2 calls a week to having a short call every morning.
Mhm.
And we have them at 10 a.m. So like now, no matter what, no matter how tired I am, no matter whatever, I have to be kind of ready at my desk to talk to my business partner at 10. And so that's kind of a way that we've held each other accountable, to have like that set kind of time. But in terms of Feminist founder, we do set goals every meeting, and then we check in on them at the next meeting. So I think that it's kind of the biggest thing from accountability circles, I think, are a lot of professional development type projects. I mean,
Yeah.
as a founder, you know how it goes. It's really easy to get kind of in that wheel of serving your client and just kind of focusing on that work, which is obviously important. But the types of things that always just fell to the bottom of my to-do list and then would begin to collect dust were things that would grow my business and would help kind of with the strategy side of things. So I think that accountability, at least for those who are self-employed, has to kind of come from what your weaknesses are as an entrepreneur, and then also just figuring out how to be able to focus on growing your business.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, everyone kind of has this projection that, everybody is great at processing tasks. They have their system, nothing falls through the cracks, and of course that doesn't happen. And I feel like that there's a bit of I don't know, the Instagram effect on starting businesses, where people might be considering jumping in, but thinking, I'm not organized enough to do that. Whereas, you meet an entrepreneur, and the first thing you realize, probably not the most organized person on earth. And so like, but this idea of structure is still, even though we resist it, it is quite important, and helping us even a little bit to kind of get forward there. Are there other kinds of things, little hacks that you do, or routines that you do to give yourself structure, that you maybe listening to yourself if past you was listening to present you thinking, no way in hell would I do that?
Definitely. Yeah. So I think that when you are an entrepreneur, you're already somebody who doesn't necessarily fit inside of the box. And so I think what's really hard when it comes down to it is that by having a routine or a structure, you've at least for me, I feel like that's kind of limiting my freedom, or like the sort of reasons why I became an entrepreneur. So for me, it's really tricky because I want to kind of live life on my own terms. But somebody very wise, a coach I was working with, told me that when you're an entrepreneur, structure allows for you to have the freedom that you desire. So once I kind of got that into my head, I started to understand that I need to do things like batch my days. So for example, I'm interested in kind of like the woo-woo stuff, like planetary alignments. So I'm working with the planets, like for example, Wednesday is the best day for communication because it's like the planet Mercury's, that kind of thing. So I'm trying to do a little bit more intuitive work with that. But it's also just, this is like a little embarrassing, but I have like I have this checklist now that I'm not going to show you because it has some personal tasks on there, like girl, wash your face at night. But I have kind of opening tasks and closing tasks, as well as my 3 main tasks I need to complete for the day. And I have it like in a sheet protector. So I use like a, erasable marker, and every day I start to check that off. So it's like, and this is embarrassing again, but this is the life of an entrepreneur. Did I brush my teeth and eat breakfast today? Did I put on real people clothes, or am I in my pajamas still? So it's kind of silly, but by holding myself accountable through to this little checklist, it helps me kind of feel like I'm having some kind of routine and structure to help me get focused. But it's not something that can be done overnight, especially because when you're an entrepreneur, you're constantly evolving and learning more about yourself. So for example, it took me pretty much, so I started my business in June of 2015. So it took me until this past January to fully understand that if I don't have like a block of kind of focus time in the afternoon, I'm going to not get as much work done, because what I've found over time for me personally is that my brain has not really started to function until about 12. So I might do things like calls or sort of more lighter administrative work in the morning. then the afternoon, I need to have a chunk of time where I can really focus, because all of a sudden something happens around 1 o'clock where I'm just like focus zone until like 6. And so I've realized I really need to protect that time.
Yeah.
That's not something I would have known when I first started out, because I didn't know when I worked best.
Yeah.
So those kind of things.
I wish I could work between 1 and 6. That is not my focus time, I'm afraid.
Are you a morning person?
Oh yeah, I'd much rather wake up at 4 and work until about noon, and then
4?
I'm done. Yeah. Oh yeah, but then get it done. I guess that kind of leads me on to, these are different times. It's you are in control of your own time, but that also means you're in control of your own time. And there's this challenge of invisible labor, especially when you're living with someone, or when you're in a relationship. And I know that you're quite interested in talking about that. So what is invisible labor?
Sure. So basically, invisible labor nowadays is known as the disproportionate, the basically household work that is unrecognized and typically kind of invisible. So basically what the term is kind of explaining is the disproportionate amount of household work that women perform over men. A lot of the research, I do want to add a caveat, is based on heterosexual relationships. So a lot of the data is focused on that. So I do want to point that out, because obviously this is applicable to, it can be roommate relationships, it can be LGBTQIA relationships, anybody can kind of fall victim to this trap. But basically, I think that one thing that's really challenging about invisible labor is that when you're self-employed, you're home. So, my partner, David, of course, but he doesn't, but he may have the perception that because I'm home, I have the time or the ability to be more running the household, or more kind of doing some of the chores, which is definitely kind of an easy assumption to make. Like if he worked from home, I would feel sort of the same way. But when it really comes down to it, especially when you're an entrepreneur, you're working for every single dollar that you make, and there's no guaranteed paycheck for most entrepreneurs. So it's even more important that I protect my time, because if I spent my days doing dishes or doing errands, or, kind of running around town doing whatever, I wouldn't get work done. So I think that's something that's really important, is to make sure that if you do decide to take the path to entrepreneurship, that you have a partner or roommate or whomever that is going to be supportive and understand that you need to protect your time, your work time, just as much as anyone else, because that's crucial.
It absolutely is crucial. So like aside from the I use micro in that the interaction relationships and the challenges that are faced there on a larger scale, what specific challenges do those who identify as female entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color face that maybe people don't really think about at first, whether or not it's a privileged white male like me, or it is someone who identifies as an underrepresented population in a particular space. What are kind of some of the challenges that maybe I should be more educated about and aware about that don't affect me?
Sure. Yeah. I think the first example that always comes to mind when I'm asked questions like this is when it comes down to negotiation. So we all know, or at least I'm sure a lot of people know, that men kind of on average, according to data and research, they negotiate more, and they also negotiate harder than women. So I think that's something that I was kind of surprised by when I first started my business. I think it was within my first year of business. I had a client who was a white male, and we decided to end the work together because it just wasn't really working well. And so I sent him the final invoice, and then kind of 2.5 weeks later, I'm like, okay, why isn't this invoice paid yet? He hasn't been late on payments before. So I got in touch with him, and I was like, hey, I just wanted to check in on this invoice. It's the last one. If the money is an issue, we can split it up if needed, but I just need to know kind of what's going on your end. Trying to be as professional as possible, because money conversations are not fun, but it's something that you have to get used to as an entrepreneur. So he came back at me, and he's like, oh no, money's not a problem at all. I'll send you a check when I get back from vacation in August, like 2 weeks later. And I was like, what? I was like, wait a second, but this invoice is late.
Overdue.
And yeah, it's overdue. And like, you can't just pay me when you feel like it. Like, that's not how it works. And I think I had a decent contract back then. My contract now is really strong, and I have very strict late payment kind of terms, very strict. But I think that I was shocked, and I could not help but wonder if I had been a fellow white man, if he had just, like, I just couldn't help but wonder if it was like something to do with bias, and maybe he was just testing me, or just kind of like not really taking me seriously. But I mean, I'm a business owner. I have an LLC. I have the legal grounds to get that money if I need to. So I think a good example of how my reaction would have been different when I first started my business, I would have said, okay, no problem. Have a good vacation. Bye. This time though, I was already a year into business and was getting used to this kind of nonsense. And so I said, actually, that's not an option. I need you to let me know that you're putting a check in the mail by the end of today, or that you're going to pay the invoice by tomorrow via the online link. I'd really like to avoid legal action because I want to end this relationship on a positive note. And he got back to me. It's like, okay, no problem. I'll pay the link tomorrow. And I was like, okay. It was just kind of weird. So I didn't know exactly what was up with that.
A power trip, man. Like, you said by the end of the day? No, sorry.
It was just really bizarre. And I just couldn't help but wonder that if it was maybe related to the fact that I was a woman, I just couldn't help but wonder. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But I think that the biggest kind of struggle in general, or at least for me, and I think especially for women entrepreneurs, is talking about money. Like, talking about money is not something that's typically kind of seen as okay in our society, which is a problem. But one thing that I think is interesting is there's a study, and I don't remember where it was from, but they said that if you place, like, let's say 20 men in one room and 20 women in a different room, and you ask them to talk about their work and their like jobs and their salaries, men, and again, this is all, it's gender research, but men on average will tend to try to one up each other, or kind of be more open about their salary and their responsibilities, whereas women try to level the playing field a lot more. And so I think that is kind of an example of what's sort of problematic in our society when it comes to talking about money, because women, I mean, it's hard for me to kind of brag about the fact that I made X amount of money in revenue last year, 88,000, yay. But it's not something that feels natural to kind of talk about to a fellow entrepreneur, especially a woman who might not be at that level. It feels weird to kind of brag, but that's a problem. We should be bragging. I'm proud of the money that my team and I have made. So I think that's kind of the biggest thing that I identify is when it comes to kind of gender and race, is kind of the conversations around money, because it's just kind of hard.
They're obviously very hard, but what are some of the kind of, or what are some tips that maybe you, having gone through it, that you'd say to people who are interested in starting a business on their own? I heard you, and especially those who might be very concerned about the money talk and the money conversation. You mentioned, a contract. You used to have a different contract. Now you have a very, very a strong contract. Are there steps aside from just training yourself to have difficult conversations that you suggest people take a look at in order to help that along?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the biggest step to take when it comes to that is deciding what type of business structure you want to have. I really do encourage that anyone, no matter if you're a freelancer, whatever, I personally feel strongly that everyone should strive to get some kind of legal entity as a business, because what a lot of people don't know is that, let's say that you're let's say that you're my client and I mess something up. You have every right to sue me. But if I have an LLC, you can only sue and bankrupt my company and not me personally. And that's a huge difference between getting personally sued and your company being liable. So I think the biggest thing is getting an LLC or some other kind of business structure to protect yourself legally. But then I think the second step is having a super solid contract. So when I first started, I was, as like most people, bootstrapping everything. So I got a template from a Rocket Lawyer, and I was like, okay, this is fine, this is great. But then basically every time an issue would come up with a client that I didn't have in my contract, I would just go in and edit it. But then finally I kind of realized this contract is how I secure my money and finances. So I finally ponied up and just got a lawyer to review my contract and give me feedback and make sure that it was like lock solid. Because I think the biggest kind of issue for entrepreneurs and freelancers in particular is getting paid on time. Like, I think kind of on average, there's millions and millions of dollars due at any given moment to freelancers in the United States, which is awful because they don't have a lot of legal ground to fight for that. So I think having a rock solid agreement is really important that has very, very specific and clear payment terms that you don't just kind of put in there and hope the client will read. A lot of people don't read contracts. That's something that I found as being a woman in business that is shocking. A lot of people don't read contracts very well. So like I would have people have my clients initial that section and then I reiterate it in their welcome packet to make sure that they're super clear that if you don't submit payment by the 5th of each month, then you will be accruing interest on the monthly fee. So, and that's something that I've gotten very strict about, and which has thankfully resulted in a lot of clients doing auto billing. And that's like every entrepreneur's dream is having kind of money that comes in. You don't have to chase it down. So that's my biggest tip. So to recap, make sure to get yourself protected as a legal business entity, get a rock solid agreement or contract, and make sure to really enforce that and make sure those terms are very clear. And auto billing is your friend.
Very good practical advice. So are there other kind of resources out there to help, especially entrepreneurs that identify as women or entrepreneurs of color, people of color, that you can kind of talk about? I know that you're based in DC for those watching, but yeah.
So I am based in Washington, D.C., so I do feel as though I'm fortunate to have a lot of resources for this kind of thing. I'm sure it's a little bit harder in towns or kind of smaller areas. So in D.C., but also nationwide, I think the biggest thing that someone should look at is a program called SCORE. It's an acronym, and it's a nationwide program that is free small business mentoring. And so that was really essential. When I first started my business, I had no idea what I was doing. So I signed up for a mentoring session, and it was so helpful to be able to talk to somebody who had a background in marketing. So basically SCORE, let me back up a little bit, is retired professionals who donate their time to help other business owners. So I was matched with a marketing person. So that was perfect because I have a social media company.
Yes.
So basically we were able to get together and meet, and he was able to give me advice on my business plan and kind of just on crafting my business into what it is now. So that was really essential, and I recommend that everyone do because it's free. And sometimes mentors can do video sessions. So even if you're in a remote town or somewhere smaller, you can still access those resources. So that one's crucial. I would say that in DC, there's a lot of different organizations, especially those geared toward women, but I'm particularly fond of a couple. So Melanin Collective is a really great resource for women of color in the DC area specifically. She Thinks Purple is an awesome organization. Beacon DC is great, especially because they have grants and funding opportunities for women business owners. So there are lots of different resources. You just have to look for them. And sometimes even if like the website is old or kind of, I don't know, strange, their resources might be really strong. So I think the other thing is not to judge a book by its cover, because sometimes like business resources are not dressed up in the most appealing way. So you just have to kind of dig through that a little bit.
Cool. Awesome. So just shifting gears in terms of the entrepreneurs that you work with, especially with the Feminist founder, why do you work with entrepreneurs?
Yeah, sure.
What inspires you working with people that are going through the kind of same challenges as you?
Yeah, of course. So I was actually at a conference led by one of my colleagues and friends, Stacey Ferguson. So she runs a brand called Blogalicious, and she also has a personal brand called Justice Fergie. So she had this annual conference, and when I was at one in October 2016, we did this session on being multi-passionate. And I was like, oh, I don't need to do this. Like I have a business. That's my passion. Like I don't need this exercise. But I did the exercise, and it turned out what came up was that I really love helping other people and empowering other people, especially women. And so kind of from that session, that's where I first got the idea for Feminist Founder. So a group and a resource for women to have people to kind of lean on and get advice and feedback from. So that's where that started. And I think that having groups like that are so important because you just get to skip a lot of stuff that most people muddle through. So for instance, like creating your ideal work day. I think sometimes we get kind of stressed and caught up with, how do I run my day? I must run it from 8 to 5. Otherwise I'm not successful because I'm not hustling. But some people work like 10 to 6 or 12 to 8. I mean, I think what you really get to learn from when you're working with other people is that everyone has their different unique way of working, and you really can choose what you want, because we got into this crazy, scary field of entrepreneurship because we wanted to be doing something different. And so that allows us the freedom. So I really love working with people who are starting businesses or have like an idea for a business or are in a business but need help kind of scaling. So a lot of the topics that we talk about in our monthly meetings are related to kind of business development. So like, for instance, we had a meeting a couple days ago, and it was about gaining back control of your email inbox, because I think that's a bane for most people. So I was able to teach them a system for really having an inbox zero that's actually manageable. So I just think that my goal is to help people save time and not make the mistakes that I did when I was first starting out. And it's along lines of like negotiating. I mean, that's just, I keep coming back to that. Money's such a big thing. Like, I had a client who, funny enough, a woman of color client, but she came back to me and was like, hey, can you give me a rate for like doing some event planning work? Because when I was first starting out, I was doing like all kinds of random things.
Yeah, everything. Yeah, trying it out. Yeah,
exactly. So I told her a rate that I will not share because it's embarrassingly low, but I told her a rate, and she came back at me and she's like, oh, this feels really high. Can you bring it down like by $5? And I was literally crafting an email saying, sure, no problem, when I stopped and I was like, wait a second, why why should I lower my hourly rate? Like, she didn't ask why it was that rate. She just said, it's too high. Can you lower it? It was a request. So that was like the defining moment where I was like, wait, hold on a second. So I just very like politely pushed back and said, oh, this hourly rate is actually lower than the market average already. And I'd love to work with you, but this is a firm rate. And she came back at me and said, okay, cool. And I was like, what? So sometimes you really have to ask, because people generally are just testing you. I mean, think about the way that you negotiate in regular life, you know, like I negotiate constantly, not in like the business context, but just in general. So you sometimes just have to ask to make that kind of thing happen.
That's really interesting. It's clearly it's all about psychology, and if only we were just really great at psychoanalyzing anyone, we'd all get ahead.
Exactly. So, and I think the other thing too that new business owners also really struggle with, because it's just really difficult to get into a good system, is systems and processes, of course. So just figuring out kind of course, how to manage your day, but then what tools and software to use, because there's so many out there. It's really easy to get overwhelmed, and I'm kind of a productivity tool junkie, so I'll kind of hop from tool to tool. But I think I've finally found my golden, I don't know, unicorn or whatever. Like, I think I've got my system.
Till next week.
Till next week. Yeah. If I tell my partner that, he would just laugh and be like, okay, come back at me in a month when you have something new that you want me to sign up for.
What's the golden unicorn?
Right now, it's funny because I used to use it and then I left and came back, but it's Meister Task. So,
all right, cool.
I had been using a really great tool that I'd like to shout out called Amazing Marvin. And that was, I believe it was designed by folks in the Netherlands, and it's specifically designed for those who have ADHD or are just really big procrastinators. So that's a really cool tool. But what I found is I wanted something super visual and pretty. So I went back to Meister Task, and I've been enjoying using that.
Cool. Well, I will probably send you tons that I've tried over the years anyway. But so, final question is around the challenges that you're specifically facing as a business.
Sure.
You're going after, like, your ideal clients are not usually the clients that you'd think are deep pocketed. So I imagine that it's a tough dynamic for you to be in terms of finding that sweet spot of a client that is able to afford you or afford anything, but also is early enough so that they do need the specific kind of help that you're offering. But what are the specific challenges that you're working on in terms of your business, and where do you see yourself in about a year's time?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think that the biggest challenge right now is scaling. So I think that at least one thing I will tell you is that you must, as an entrepreneur, you must learn how to delegate or you will drown. It is a fact. You cannot do everything if you want to grow. It's just not possible. So I think that the biggest struggle for a lot of people who are kind of in my level or, age of business is figuring out how to grow. And so for me, it was hiring. I'm actually I have no problem delegating. So I delegate a lot. So I have a great team. I have a business partner and a team of contractors. And so I'm able to kind of delegate all that work. But I think the biggest thing that's been tricky for us is figuring out how to scale our company that was kind of more focused on small businesses and entrepreneurs to now being attractive to larger like medium, large companies and
Yeah.
corporations. So, because when I first started out with the social media company, I was still learning social media kind of strategy. And so the way I would kind of present myself to clients is, let me help you keep your profiles active,
Mhm.
because even if you're, X industry, people still might try to check you out on Facebook or something like that. So it's good to at least have an active presence.
Yeah.
So it was less strategy and more just kind of active presence. So fast forward, almost, I guess, what is it now? A little over 3.5 years later, we are now working with clients and brands like a Hilton Hotel and a Hyatt Hotel. And that's obviously way more intensive and strategic than just keeping your profile active.
Yeah.
So I think that the biggest transition and struggle right now is figuring out how to shift our messaging and our frameworks on our website to attract those larger clients,
Sure.
but also still be able to serve clients who are at that lower level. So when I met with my business partner, one thing that we did was try to think about our ideal client and things like that. And the biggest thing that came from our meeting that was interesting was that when it came down to it, our ideal client is someone that has a marketing budget. So this is somebody who's not necessarily like a small business owner or solopreneur who's kind of like feeling the pain of that money leaving their pocket every month. This is somebody who has kind of like that dedicated budget for social media marketing or marketing. And so that's what we realize is our ideal client, which naturally means that our ideal client has shifted to more of medium, large, and corporations.
Sure.
So yeah. So
So
figuring out how to kind of do that in an appropriate way that still kind of balances our original mission to serve entrepreneurs and small businesses. So that's been the biggest struggle, is figuring out how to
portray your identity as a business.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's so many great businesses out there. Like we just are in the process of signing a contract with an artist who's pretty renowned, and it's super exciting. But she's kind of starting as a smaller fish kind of package, but she wants to grow with us, and so that's great. And we're able to provide a solution that will work for her and her budget. But then we also just landed this month our largest client ever. And that's been super, super, super exciting. And so it's just interesting to be able to still be able to serve smaller clients that need us, as well as larger corporations who can afford us and have all the resources. They just need someone to kind of do the work. So I'd say that's the biggest struggle.
Interesting challenge, though. Yeah.
Grow, but not grow too fast.
Exactly. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for taking the time and chatting. And I really do appreciate it. And best of luck with everything.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Rob. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Bye.